of Southern Africans. We can no longer have a Rhodes scholarship that caters in the main to students from the Western world, in particular white students, when in fact the money for the configuration of the entire scholarship is from people of Zambia, of Zimbabwe, of South Africa, who only receive one scholarship out of several, the majority of which are given to North Americans, Australians, etc. And even in the case of places like Zimbabwe and South Africa, white Zimbabweans and white South Africans. Attention to just how empire still continued to influence the perspectives of the university, of the city, of the country, how racism was still a real and structuring reality in that environment. While what we still want is for the curricula to be reworked, what we still want is for there to be a more diverse body of academics that represents the world that university purports to be giving an education on. Otherwise, then it isn't everything that it says. It is still an emblem and a microcosm of the empire that was so destructive through imperialism, colonialism, apartheid, and the various genocides that are undertaken by European empires on the continent.
Thank you very much. If you really wanted to hear more about the movement in South Africa, the whole insight, actually we have a platform almost like 2 hours talking, so maybe we should give her a break and like to have the whole afternoon to prepare. But before you go, I wanted to ask you the last question, like what is generally the place of women in the whole movement, like you were explained, and what is the women, like their part in
right.
Because yeah,
right. As usual, like any movement, like anywhere else, the role that women play in RhodesMustFall and in FeesMustFall is misarticulated, because what the ways in which movements are represented is through like the action of the moment, and that has been the case with RhodesMustFall, for example, with Khumani Makwele being the one to throw the feces on the statue and then everybody beginning to pay attention, or with people like Mcebo Dlamini leading mass protests into the city or to the union buildings in Pretoria, when in fact the role of women in the decolonizing movements such as RhodesMustFall and FeesMustFall is an inaugural one. It was women, it was queer bodies at the University of Cape Town who did everything to establish the movement that is now RhodesMustFall, but of course didn't take up the front and center on the newspapers, weren't the ones to be called to the interviews, to have these, macho back and forths about the movements, and white sensibilities about violence. Where you're protesting, will you be violent? Are you threatening our sacred spaces in academia and like Cape Town or Johannesburg, suburbia, etc. And so that preoccupation, that like colonial preoccupation with black presence being about violence, has reflected the movements as very masculine movements, when in fact the work of inaugurating, the work of building those movements has been through the queer collectives and the women in particular. I remember when we started Decolonize Wits, this was back in about 2013, the body of people who were writing the memoranda, who were reviewing curricula, were women. But when it came to the activism work of protest action, then it was the men who came to the fore via political parties such as the ANC, the EFF, and student formations like SASCO. As far as RhodesMustFall is concerned, there also, black women in particular, were very much at the fore of the work that needed to be done. It was myself, Tadiwa Madinga, and Rose, who were responsible, for example, for organizing the march on Oxford in March 2016. And there is an article very soon, I think around March, we'll be publishing a book on RhodesMustFall through Z Publishing. And there is also an article on the black women of the RhodesMustFall movement that is online, but will be also a part of the book, to demonstrate the internal antagonisms that occur as a result of, patriarchy and its attitudes, sexism and its attitudes, anti-blackness and its attitudes, in movements of solidarity that are about, for example, marginalized groups, but wherein even among those marginalized groups, anti-blackness is still a force that pushes black people, black bodies to the periphery, even though it's on the back of those bodies that movement exists in the first place. So we try to highlight that, particularly with the RhodesMustFall at Oxford movement, through the publication work that we do, but particularly through the book and the role that women have with editing the book and making sure that, like, often in the historical record, women disappear because men are able to take up the space. Other men want to talk to other men, even if those men are in conflict. So the radio station will call the guy that they see at the fore. The TV interview will call the most provocative character, such as Ntokozo Kwabe, to come and do the interview. And so in the minds of everyone, the RhodesMustFall movement is about this one guy, when in fact the work that goes in to making that movement work, even the work of leading that movement, is through women of color, but in particular Black African women, Black diasporic women.
Yeah, I wanted to correct, actually we talk not today but tomorrow about decolonization of education, and also I think on the panel about the queer movement, and our symposium, it's all about reimagination and reshaping the future. Maybe in a short word, so we will go to our friend also Nana here present, the blogger, also African feminist. Can you maybe tell us what is the future, the hope also for like this movement and all the conscience that you have in South Africa, like the future on generally in African education and reimagining and a hope for the future for the whole continent, like generally.
So I imagine that African peoples are going to have to, and this is through the work that is being done by queer people, by women people, by queer women in particular, are going to have to disabuse themselves of the kind of liberation politics that they have become accustomed to. I think they're going to have to make sure that this round of thinking decolonization, because decolonization is as old as colonialism itself, at least conceptually, and even as like a movement of West and East Africa in the 60s, 70s, but that we're going to have to think about decolonizing, whether in education or in politics, as a more intersectional work. Not just intersectional in kind of the ways in which European academia has appropriated intersectionality, which is actually the work of a black woman, black African American woman, who's thinking about the position of black women who are the most peripheral in society. That is the kind of intersectionality that our decolonizing movements are going to have to accept. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in this rut of doing decolonizing every 30 or so years, because we haven't been thoroughgoing in terms of how we think of inclusivity and how we think of disrupting the structures that continue to make particular bodies, particular people, anti-human, less than human. So that's the future that I imagine, but it's a future that I think is going to take a fight, and perhaps a fight that is that we're not ready for, but one that we're going to have if we are serious about decolonizing.
Yeah, thank you.